Fanzin Fanzin look so that will Yonji lighter and the planet. Piatanaria Bushode. Below Busho Lanoso. The Goshin up Fanzin Lupi Lare. Come on, look at you, Fanzin Solution. The Goshin ha. A Genadia see the la, Pinya see the lachia. A Genadia see me saying, the Rawari comes out over Fanzin Bia. No, the Rawari comes up over Fanzin Bia. The Rawari go Tankade so Maloau, Genadia see. Maybe Fanzin had it. The Rawari, Bioshin Chami, the needed Fanzin Bible. So I do. Fanzina Mahoda Mabe, go a mapchella, go down the midi, Poma. Mibari had two neither made a tanager. Beda be the me of Sissy. Allo, do you dear abuse to be good and good me, Chiwasi in a sanashit. Error way the goshing of Fanzina did, the midi to pure. Hey, the midi, Emma. Lema read that midi, Shima, might at that midi, Shima. Beda the me web Chinna put a cool in it. Counsa on. Tu Fanzemaro. The Magona say board that we will count a say ball on Fanzan light up. No, but not at that we will allow on Fanzan light. Pinya Madade that we will Pinya down on Fanzan light bubble. Fanzan 9 years so maro, companzan. Erelo Mohobene Fanzan I had done it. Lujin to Bali had done it. The Chojaro, Yoso, Chitani, Fanzan like that. Africa died that is a majorly on Fanzan, no? Uroba Lurido, Carapunisa, GDP on Fanzan. But Mari Jaro, Chojolo, Mount Lala Baba on Fanzan. Aido, tu Fanzana, but Maria Ginagon Gina Leve, Africa, Gina Chimachina, no? Do it cheat about. Do it cheat. Gina Mammo. Anyway, Chanda and Dudiga. Gina Mapsitole, say it to the Gina Naimu. Tururo, Chana on Fanzane, Arojaro, Chana on Mafanze Musovi. Pitimave. Ereluri, Pilla Nainebo. A Pilla Naini Dredja. Fanzation Sura, Luranga Lekan Mam Honam. Luranga Gino Jama Mahofu. Dodo purely me. Luri Magano, Dilupia, Ludo. A pig I told you. Edo, Magani and go on my Panzan people, Panzan night now, eh? The Goshi de solution, Magana Lu, go on look bila. Say to that Lu, say she on Panzan Billa. Doda Gilu, Doda Maji on Panzan Billa. Allo let low names one share than it, but look a bit, eh? Major sheila, no? Edo, yes of Yaga. Pago, we van top yap, be the little solution. Panzin sing up, Panzin de look, Panzin look, Pierre de look so that. A dwe call a dee, Mingo. Let can't have a book de out for it. Go in load in a case, load in a case, switch we are, take them shit over. Pablo Rosoy. Pierre again, Lord Roger, Pierre Mave. Go, you chat was a malo. However, we do, Lord Roger, time, do Panzana. Garania, sorry, load in a case, and load in a case. Sura, Luria, go, you chat, nature, take them shoe. Them, Lurobu, Lusana, Swale, though we know, Sana Alios or Juba Atomu Swale, though we know, a chain down Lucian, Panzation, Ali, two seamen, Kaya Mavipsit. Erajamulu, Louis Lola Wiria, Dipina, Sanaru, Domo and Nora, Psit 190. Send a live solution, Luria. For what yada de kama? A young one the muire bugushide, no. The Rawari then the muire bugushide. Magone do say I didn't the muire bugurishide, swing we young chabi the muire bugurishide. အဲ့ဒါဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ရွှေဆိုင်ဖွင့်ပြီးတော့ရွှေရောင်းရတာလေဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့လားတခိုးဓမြဖြစ်ပြီးတော့သူများပစ္စည်းကိုလူယူတိုက်ခို့ကိုကြိုးစားတာလေဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့လားအဲ့တော့ဖန်ဆင်းပြီးရင်ထောင်ထဲကြတော့လည်းပဲဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့ထောင်ချတယ်တရားသူကြီးကချတာမဟုတ်ဘူးအဲ့ဒါဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တရားသူကြီးကထောင်ချတာမဟုတ်ဘူးအပြစ်ကထောင်ချတာမဟုတ်ဘူးဘုရားသခင်ကထောင်ချတယ်ဆိုရပြောเสียအပြစ်အနာစာတွေအများကြီးဖြစ်လာစဉ်းစားเสียတွေအများကြီးဖြစ်လာအဲ့ဒါမြတ်စွာဘုရားစဉ်းစားပြဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့သူ့တဲ့တန်နေရတယ်ဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့သူများဥစ္စာခိုးနေရတယ်ဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့ဂျာကူရီဘဝရောက်နေတယ်ဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့လူလိမ်လူခေါက်ဖြစ်နေရတယ်ဘုရားသခင်ဖန်ဆင်းလို့မူရစ်စေဝါတွေသုံးနေရတယ်ဆိုတဲ့အဓိပ္ပာယ်မျိုးတွေဖြစ်ကုန်ရောအဲ့ဒါလို့မစီလျော်တဲ့အခြေအနေမျိုးတွေဖြစ်ပေါ်လာစေတယ်ဒါကြောင့်မြတ်စွာဘုရားကအဲ့ဒါဟာမှန်ကန်မှုမရှိဘူးတကယ်ကတော့လူဘဝရလာတယ်ဆိုတာဟာဘယ်သူမပြုမိမိမှုမိမိကိုယ်တိုင်လုပ်ခဲ့တဲ့အတိုင်းလူတွေဟာကိုလှုပ်တာကိုရကြတာလားဖြစ်တယ်ကိုလှုပ်တာကိုရတယ်ဆိုဟုတ်တယ်ကိုအသက်မွေးဝမ်းကြောင်းမုံဖုတ်ပြီးအသက်မွေးမယ်ရွှေရောင်းချပြီးအသက်မွေးမယ်စတိုးဆိုင်ဖွင့်ပြီးအသက်မွေးမယ်တကူကိုလှုပ်နဲ့ကိုလှုပ်နေကြတာပဲလေကိုဝါသနာပါရလှုပ်ကြတာပြီးတော့အလုတ်မကောင်းမှုဆိုလည်းပြောင်းလို့ရလေဖန်ဆင်းထိုင်ပြောင်းလို့မရတော့ဘူးဖန်ဆင်းကြတယ်ဒီတိုင်းဖန်ဆင်းလိုက်တာဆိုပြောင်းမရအခုကပြောင်းရကိုဒီအလုတ်မကြိုက်ဘူးဆိုနောက်တစ်လုတ်ပြောင်းရတချို့ဆိုဆရာဝန်တင်တန်းတက်ပြီးတော့ဘွဲတွေပါတွေရပြီးတော့ဆရာဝန်လုံးမစားခြင်းတို့တခါဈေးရောင်းစားတာတွေလည်းပြည့်အဲ့တော့ဘုရားသခင်ကလွယ်လွယ်မမဖန်ဆင်းလိုက်သလားမသိဘူးအဲ့ဒါကြတော့နော်မင်းဆရာဝန်ဆေးကြောင်းတော့တက်ဒါပေမဲ့မင်းဆရာဝန်မလုံးနဲ့လို့များဖန်ဆင်းလိုက်သလားအဲ့ဒီလိုတွေစဉ်းစားစရာတွေဖြစ်ကုန်တယ်နော်တကယ်ကတော့လူတွေဟာကိုယ်ဆုံးဖြတ်ချက်နဲ့ကိုယ်လုံးနေကြတာဆိုတာထင်ရှားတယ်ကိုယ်ဆုံးဖြတ်ချက်နဲ့အဲ့တော့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကကမ္မတက္ကတာတမ္မာဒိဋ္ဌိလူဘဝရလာတယ်ဆိုတာတဲ့ကိုယ်လုံးတာနောက်မို့ဆိုလေးရှိတယ် we are our own architect ကိုဘဝကိုပဲဖန်ဆင်းလာအဲ့ဒီအယူဆအမြင်ကိုဘုန်းကြီးတို့တော့အလွန်ကျေနပ်တယ်ဘာဖြစ်လို့လဲဆိုကောင်းလဲကိုမှတောင်းရှိတယ်မကောင်းလဲကိုပဲတောင်းရှိတယ်အလွန်ကိုလွတ်လပ်တယ်အလွန်ကိုလွတ်လပ်တယ်ကိုဘာဖြစ်ချင်တယ်လဲဖြစ်အောင်လုပ်ကိုဘာကြိုက်တယ်လဲကြိုက်တာလုပ်လို့ရလူတွေကမသိခင်လည်းပဲဒီလိုပဲရွေးကြတာပဲလေရွေးကြတာကိုကြိုက်တဲ့ပညာသင်တယ်ကိုလှုပ်ချင်တဲ့လုပ်ငန်းလုပ်ကြတယ်လုပ်ကြတာကိုယ့်ကိုရွေးချယ်မှုနဲ့သွားကြတာပဲဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့အဲ့တော့ဘဝမှာလည်းပဲကိုယ့်ကိုရွေးချယ်လို့ရတယ်မြတ်စွာဘုရားကအကြောင်းနဲ့အကျိုးဟောထားတာဖြစ်လို့ဒါနကောင်းမှုလုပ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေဟာဟိုဘဝကျတော့ချမ်းသာကြွယ်ဝမယ်သီလကောင်းမှုလုပ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေဟာကျမ်းမာမယ်သက်ရှိမယ်နော်ဒါနသီလပြည့်စုံတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေကလူဘဝလူချမ်းသာကိုရတယ်လွန်လွန်ကဲကဲဒါနသီလကိုလုပ်ပြီးဆိုရင်နတ်ဘဝကိုရောက်တယ်နတ်ပြည်ရောက်ပြီးတော့ချမ်းသာမယ်သမထကျင့်စဉ်တစ်ခုကိုအောင်မြင်မြင်ကျင့်မယ်ဆိုရင်ဗြဟ္မဘုံရောက်တယ်ကဘာကြာအောင်ကဘာပေါင်းများစွာကြာအောင်အသက်ရှိတယ်ဝိပဿနာကျင့်စဉ်ကိုကျင့်လိုက်လို့ရှိရင်တဏှာဝကလွတ်မြောက်တယ်ဆိုတာသူကျင့်စဉ်နဲ့သူအကြောင်းနဲ့သူဟာသူဒီလိုဟောတာဘယ်သူမှဖန်ဆင်းတာမဟုတ်အဲ့ဒီလိုလွတ်လပ်တယ်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုလုံးလို့ရဖျားဖြစ်ပြီးတော့တရားတွေကိုကဲ့တင်ခြင်းလည်းပဲဖျားစုပန်ပြီးပါရမီဖြစ်တယ်နော်အေးဖျားမဖြစ်ဖျားဖြစ်ရမှာပါရမီဖြစ်ရမှာကြောက်တယ်အဲ့ကတာဝကလောက်ဆိုတော်ပါပြီဆိုရင်လေပါရမီဖြစ်ဖျားမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးဖျားအဖေအမေဖြစ်ချင်တယ်ဆိုတော့ပါရမီဖြစ်လို့ရအဲ့ဒါလို့ပေါ့အမျိုးစုံကိုကြိုက်တာကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချယ်ခွင့်ရှိကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချယ်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချယ်ခွင့်ရှိတာဘယ်လောက်ချစ်နေစရာ နော်အခုခေတ်မှာဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ကိုယ့်အကိုရွေးချက်ခွင့်မရှိတာတွေဟာရှိသေးတယ်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးချက်ခွင့်မရှိဘူးဆေးချောင်းတက်ချင်တဲ့အမှတ်က300လောက်400လောက်ဖြစ်တယ်ရွေးလို့မရဗျာနော်အင်ဂျင်နီယာဝင်နေတဲ့အမှတ်နဲ့နေရွေးလို့မရဗျာကိုကြိုက်တာတောင်မှပဲလူဘဝဟာရွေးလို့မရတာအများကြီးရှိတယ်အဲ့တော့ဒီကံတရားနဲ့ပတ်သက်လာလို့ရှိရင်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးလို့ရလုံးဝဆောင်ဝဲအမှတ်နဲ့ချိတ်ဆက်ထားတာမရှိဘူးနော်ကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးကိုကြိုက်တာကိုရွေးပြီးတော့အလုပ်ပဲလုပ်ဖို့လိုတယ်ပညာတတ်ကြီးဖြစ်ခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ပညာပါရမီဖြစ်ပညာပါရမီဖြစ်ရသင်ကြားရမယ်ပညာတကယ်ကိုတကူရှင်ကြီးဖြစ်ခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုတကူရခြင်းအကြောင်းတရားတွေကိုလို့သူတို့ဆိုလိုတာပေါ့နော်အဲ့တော့ကိုချောမောလှပခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ပြုံးပြုံးလေးနေစိတ်မဆိုးနဲ့စိတ်ဆိုးရင်လူဟာစိတ်ဆိုးရင်အယုတ်ဆိုးကြည့်တတ်တယ်လေဒေါသထွက်လာလို့ရှိရင်လူဟာနှုတ်ခမ်းညက်ဆူတာချောတဲ့လူတောင်မှပဲစိတ်ဆိုးရင်အလှပြက်သွားတာပဲဒါသဘာဝနော်ခဏခဏစိတ်တူလို့ရှိရင်အဲ့ဒီပုံစံကြီးဖြစ်လာတာဒါကြောင့်မို့ထံပြင်းဒေါသကြည်လွန်ကအလှပြက်ပြီဆိုစိတ်တူရတဲ့လူဟာဖြစ်လျက်ဘဝမှာမျက်နှာကြီးကထဏ္ဍန်ကြီးနဲ့ဟုတ်လားမျက်နှာပုတ်ကြီးနဲ့ဖြစ်တတ်တယ်တဲ့အဲ့ဒါအစရေကဒေါသမရှိဘူးအလုံးကပြုံးပြုံးရွှင်ရွှင်ခင်ခင်မင်မင်နေတတ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တယောက်ဟာအဲ့ဒီကြည်လင်တဲ့မျက်နှာနဲ့ပဲဘဝမှာဖြစ်တယ်ဟောသူလုပ်ခဲ့တဲ့အတိုင်းသူဖြစ်တာလေအသားဖြူခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တချို့ကအသားဖြူခြင်းတို့လည်းဖျောင်းနိုင်လှူတယ်အဲ့ဒါတော့သိမစီဆိုင်ဘူးတမန်တော့အသားဖြူခြင်းတို့ဖျောင်းနိုင်လှူတာတဲ့တချို့တက္ကမကြီးတွေကြမ်းကြမ်းဖန်ဖန်အဲ့လိုလုပ်တယ်ဖျောင်းနိုင်လှူတာတောင်ရိုးရိုးမလှူအသားဖြူခြင်းတို့ထုံးလှူပါလားဆိုထုံးတော့မလှူအဲ့ဒါဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မိသွေးလှူလို့ရှိရင်အသားမဲမယ်ဆိုပုံစံဖြစ်အဲ့ဒါလို့လည်းမဟုတ်နိုင်ဘူးနော်အတုံးကတခြားစီဘူးတုံးကတခြားဆိုလိုရင်းကအသားဖြူတာဟာချောမောလှပခြင်းနဲ့မှပါတယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်မေတ္တာရှိတဲ့မျက်နှာရှင်ဟာချောမောလှပမှာဒေါသကြီးတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဟာဖြစ်လျက်ဘဝမှာဒီရုပ်ဆိုးချစ်တံဒီဘဝမှာဒါနကောင်းမှုလုပ်လို့ရှိရင်နောက်မှချမ်းသာကြွယ်ဝလို့ဖြစ်တယ်မလူရဲ့မတန်းရဲ့နှမျောဖက်နေတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဒီနောက်ဘဝကျစားရမယ်မဲ့တောင်းရမယ်ဖြစ်တယ်ဒီဘဝပညာမသိတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ကနောက်ဘဝလည်းပညာတတ်ဖို့ခက်ခဲတယ်ပညာသိတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ကနောက်ဘဝပညာတတ်နိုင်တယ်သူများအသက်မတတ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဒီနောက်ဘဝအသက်ရှိသူများအသက်တွေတတ်ပြီးတော့အသက်ရှိပါစေဆုတောင်းလို့လည်းမရဘူးအသက်တူတတ်တယ်သူများကိုနှိပ်စက်ညှဉ်းပန်းတဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဒီတစ်ဖက်သားခံရတယ်လို့သူလည်းယောဂဝေဒနာတွေဖြစ်ပြီးတော့ဖြစ်တယ်မူရစေဝါရှောင်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်ဟာနောက်ဘဝမှာအယူအနံ့မဖြစ်ဘူးမူရစေဝါသုံးဆွဲလို့ရှိရင်မူးတယ်ဆိုတာမူးတယ်ဆိုတဲ့အယူဖြစ်တာပဲလေအဲ့ဒီမူရစေဝါသုံးပြီဆိုရင်နောက်ဘဝမှာအယူအနံ့သွားဖြစ်တယ်တော့အဲ့ဒါလို့သူ့အကြောင်းနဲ့သူ့အကျိုးကြည့်လိုက်တဲ့အခါကျတော့ကိုကောင်းစားခြင်းနဲ့ဆိုရင်ကိုကောင်းတဲ့အလုပ်ပဲလုပ်ဖို့လိုတယ်အဲ့ဒါအလုံးကိုလွတ်လပ်လို့အလွန်ကျင့်တတ်တယ်ဘုန်းကြီးတို့လွန်ကျင့်တတ်တယ်အဲ့လိုမဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့တဏ္ဍာရဘုရားသခင်ကဘယ်တော့မှမလဲဆိုတဲ့ညနာလေးမော့ပြီးမျောနေရမယ်ဘဝဟာအလွန်ဆိုးတဲ့ဘဝပဲနော်သူစိတ်ပါမှာဖန်ဆဲမှာစိတ်မပိုင်ပြစ်ထားလဲကိုခံရမှာဘာလုပ်လို့မရဘူးဟုတ်အဲ့လိုမဟုတ်ဘူးမြတ်စွာဘုရားကြတော့အဲ့တော့ကိုလှုပ်တာကိုရတယ်ဆိုကိုယ့်ကိုကြိုးစားလို့ရှိရင်ကိုကြိုးစားတဲ့အတိုင်းဖြစ်လာဝိရိယရဲ့အကျိုးရှိလာဒါမှမဟုတ်ဗမာစကားမှာလဲကြိုးစားကဘုရားတောင်ဖြစ်တယ်ဆိုတာရှိတယ်ပေါ့အဲ့ဒါဟာကျင့်တတ်ဖွယ်အကောင်းဆုံးအဲ့ဒါကမ္မတက္ကတာသမာဓိဋ္ဌိဆိုတဲ့ကံကံဤအကျိုးပေါ်မှာမိခိုးရှုမြင်တတ်တဲ့အတိညာဟာဘလောက်ထိအောင် လူတွေရဲ့ဘဝကိုအထက်တန်းကိုရောက်သွားစေနိုင်တယ်ဆိုတာစဉ်းစားကြည့်ပေါ့ဒါမို့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကံကံဤကျိုးကိုယုံကြည်လက်ခံခြင်းသိမြင်ခြင်းဆိုတဲ့ကာမတက္ကတာသမ္မာဒိဋ္ဌိဟာမှန်ကန်တဲ့အမြင်တစ်ခုဖြစ်တယ်အဲ့ဒီမှန်ကန်တဲ့အမြင်ကိုအခြေခံပြီးဒါနကောင်းမှုသီလကောင်းမှုလုပ်ခြင်းအပြင်လူတွေဟာချမ်းသာဒုက္ခရကြတယ်ဆိုတာကိုအတိအကျဟောထားတာဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့
The Story of Patriarchs and Prophets by Ellen G. White. Chapter 1. Why was sin permitted? God is love. His nature, His law is love. It ever has been, it ever will be. The high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity, whose ways are everlasting, changeth not. With Him is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Every manifestation of creative power is an expression of infinite love. The sovereignty of God involves fullness of blessing to all created beings. The psalmist says, "Strong is thy hand, and high is thy right hand. Righteousness and judgment are the foundation of thy throne. Mercy and truth go before thy face. Blessed is the people that know the joyful sound. They walk, O Lord, in the light of thy countenance. In thy name do they rejoice all the day, and in thy righteousness are they exalted. For thou art the glory of their strength. For our shield belongeth unto Jehovah, and our King to the Holy One." Psalm 89:13-18, Revised Version. The history of the great conflict between good and evil, from the time it first began in heaven to the final overthrow of rebellion and the total eradication of sin, is also a demonstration of God's unchanging love. The Sovereign of the universe was not alone in His work of beneficence. He had an associate, a co-worker who could appreciate His purposes and could share His joy in giving happiness to created beings. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Christ the Word, the only begotten of God, was one with the eternal Father, one in nature, in character, in purpose, the only being that could enter into all the counsels and purposes of God. His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. His goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. And the Son of God declares concerning Himself, "The Lord possessed me in the beginning of His way. Before His works of old I was set up from everlasting. When He appointed the foundations of the earth, then I was by Him as one brought up with Him, and I was daily His delight, rejoicing always before Him." The Father wrought by His Son in the creation of all heavenly beings. By Him were all things created, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by Him and for Him. Angels are God's ministers, radiant with a light ever flowing from His presence, and speeding on rapid wing to execute His will. But the Son, the anointed of God, the express image of His person, the brightness of His glory, upholding all things by the word of His power, holds supremacy over them all. A glorious high throne from the beginning was the place of His sanctuary, a scepter of righteousness, a scepter of His kingdom. Honor and majesty were before Him. Strength and beauty are in His sanctuary. Mercy and truth go before His face. The law of love being the foundation of the government of God, the happiness of all intelligent beings depends upon their perfect accord with its great principles of righteousness. God desires from all His creatures a service of love, service that springs from an appreciation of His character. He takes no pleasure in a forced obedience, and to all He grants freedom of will that they may render Him voluntary service. So long as all created beings acknowledged the allegiance of love, there was perfect harmony throughout the universe of God. It was the joy of the heavenly host to fulfill the purpose of their Creator. They delighted in reflecting His glory and showing forth His praise. And while love to God was supreme, love for one another was confiding and unselfish. There was no note of discord to mar the celestial harmonies. But a change came over this happy state. there was one who perverted the freedom that God had granted to His creatures. Sin originated with him who next to Christ had been most honored of God and was highest in power and glory among the inhabitants of heaven. Lucifer, son of the morning, was first of the covering cherubs, holy and undefiled. He stood in the presence of the great Creator, and the ceaseless beams of glory enshrouding the eternal God rested upon him. Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering. Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou hast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee. Little by little, Lucifer came to indulge the desire for self-exaltation. The Scripture says, Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. Thou hast said in thine heart, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will be like the Most High. Though all his glory was from God, this mighty angel came to regard it as pertaining to himself. Not content with his position, though honored above the heavenly host, he ventured to covet homage due alone to the Creator. Instead of seeking to make God supreme in the affections and allegiance of all created beings, it was his endeavor to secure their service and loyalty to himself. And coveting the glory with which the infinite Father had invested his Son, this Prince of Angels aspired to power that was the prerogative of Christ alone. Now the perfect harmony of heaven was broken. Lucifer's disposition to serve himself instead of his Creator aroused a feeling of apprehension when observed by those who considered that the glory of God should be supreme. In heavenly council, the angels pleaded with Lucifer. The Son of God presented before him the greatness, the goodness, and the justice of the Creator, and the sacred, unchanging nature of His law. God Himself had established the order of heaven, and in departing from it, Lucifer would dishonor his Maker and bring ruin upon himself. But the warning given in infinite love and mercy only aroused a spirit of resistance. Lucifer allowed his jealousy of Christ to prevail and became the more determined. To dispute the supremacy of the Son of God, thus impeaching the wisdom and love of the Creator, had become the purpose of this Prince of Angels. To this object he was about to bend the energies of that master mind which next to Christ's was first among the hosts of heaven. But he who would have the will of all his creatures free left none unguarded to the bewildering sophistry by which rebellion would seek to justify itself. Before the great contest should open, all were to have a clear presentation of his will, whose wisdom and goodness were the spring of all their joy. The King of the universe summoned the heavenly host before him, that in their presence he might set forth the true position of his Son, and show the relation he sustained to all created beings. The Son of God shared the Father's throne, and the glory of the eternal, self-existent One encircled both. About the throne gathered the holy angels, a vast, unnumbered throng, 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. The most exalted angels as ministers and subjects, rejoicing in the light that fell upon them from the presence of the Deity. Before the assembled inhabitants of heaven, the King declared that none but Christ, the only begotten of God, could fully enter into His purposes, and to Him it was committed to execute the mighty counsels of His will. The Son of God had wrought the Father's will in the creation of all the hosts of heaven, and to Him as well as to God their homage and allegiance were due. Christ was still to exercise divine power in the creation of the earth and its inhabitants, but in all this He would not seek power or exaltation for Himself, contrary to God's plan, but would exalt the Father's glory and execute His purposes of beneficence and love. The angels joyfully acknowledged the supremacy of Christ. and prostrating themselves before him, poured out their love and adoration. Lucifer bowed with them, but in his heart there was a strange, fierce conflict. Truth, justice, and loyalty were struggling against envy and jealousy. The influence of the holy angels seemed for a time to carry him with them. As songs of praise ascended in melodious strains, swelled by thousands of glad voices, the spirit of evil seemed vanquished. Unutterable love thrilled his entire being. His soul went out in harmony with the sinless worshippers, in love to the Father and the Son. But again he was filled with pride in his own glory. His desire for supremacy returned, and envy of Christ was once more indulged. The high honors conferred upon Lucifer were not appreciated as God's special gift, and therefore called forth no gratitude to his Creator. He gloried in his brightness and exaltation and aspired to be equal with God. He was beloved and reverenced by the heavenly host. Angels delighted to execute his commands, and he was clothed with wisdom and glory above them all. Yet the Son of God was exalted above him as one in power and authority with the Father. He shared the Father's counsels, while Lucifer did not thus enter into the purposes of God. Why, questioned this mighty angel, should Christ have the supremacy? Why is he honored above Lucifer? Leaving his place in the immediate presence of the Father, Lucifer went forth to diffuse a spirit of discontent among the angels. He worked with mysterious secrecy and for a time concealed his real purpose under an appearance of reverence for God. He began to insinuate doubts concerning the laws that governed heavenly beings, intimating that though laws might be necessary for the inhabitants of the worlds, angels, being more exalted, needed no such restraint, for their own wisdom was a sufficient guide. They were not beings that could bring dishonor to God. All their thoughts were holy. It was no more possible for them than for God himself to err. The exaltation of the Son of God as equal with the Father was represented as an injustice to Lucifer, who it was claimed was also entitled to reverence and honor. If this Prince of Angels could but attain to his true exalted position, great good would accrue to the entire host of heaven, for it was his object to secure freedom for all. But now even the liberty which they had hitherto enjoyed was at an end, for an absolute ruler had been appointed them, and to his authority all must pay homage. Such were the subtle deceptions that through the wiles of Lucifer were fast obtaining in the heavenly courts. There had been no change in the position or authority of Christ. Lucifer's envy and misrepresentation and his claims to equality with Christ had made necessary a statement of the true position of the Son of God. But this had been the same from the beginning. Many of the angels were, however, blinded by Lucifer's deception. Taking advantage of the loving, loyal trust reposed in him by the holy beings under his command, he had so artfully instilled into their minds his own distrust and discontent that his agency was not discerned. Lucifer had presented the purposes of God in a false light, misconstruing and distorting them to excite dissent and dissatisfaction. He cunningly drew his hearers on to give utterance to their feelings. Then these expressions were repeated by him when it would serve his purpose as evidence that the angels were not fully in harmony with the government of God. While claiming for himself perfect loyalty to God, he urged that changes in the order and laws of heaven were necessary for the stability of the divine government. Thus, while working to excite opposition to the law of God and to instill his own discontent into the minds of the angels under him, he was ostensibly seeking to remove dissatisfaction and to reconcile disaffected angels to the order of heaven. While secretly fomenting discord and rebellion, he with consummate craft caused it to appear as his sole purpose to promote loyalty and to preserve harmony and peace. The spirit of dissatisfaction thus kindled was doing its baleful work. While there was no open outbreak, division of feeling imperceptibly grew up among the angels. There were some who looked with favor upon Lucifer's insinuations against the government of God. Although they had heretofore been in perfect harmony with the order which God had established, they were now discontented and unhappy because they could not penetrate his unsearchable counsels. They were dissatisfied with his purpose in exalting Christ. These stood ready to second Lucifer's demand for equal authority with the Son of God. But angels who were loyal and true maintained the wisdom and justice of the divine decree and endeavored to reconcile this disaffected being to the will of God. Christ was the Son of God. He had been one with him before the angels were called into existence. He had ever stood at the right hand of the Father. His supremacy, so full of blessing to all who came under its benignant control, had not heretofore been questioned. The harmony of heaven had never been interrupted. Wherefore should there now be discord? The loyal angels could see only terrible consequences from this dissension, and with earnest entreaty they counseled the disaffected ones to renounce their purpose and prove themselves loyal to God by fidelity to his government. In great mercy, according to his divine character, God bore along with Lucifer. The spirit of discontent and disaffection had never before been known in heaven. It was a new element, strange, mysterious, unaccountable. Lucifer himself had not at first been acquainted with the real nature of his feelings. For a time he had feared to express the workings and imaginings of his mind, yet he did not dismiss them. He did not see whither he was drifting, but such efforts as infinite love and wisdom only could devise were made to convince him of his error. His disaffection was proved to be without cause, and he was made to see what would be the result of persisting in revolt. Lucifer was convinced that he was in the wrong. He saw that the Lord is righteous in all his ways and holy in all his works, that the divine statutes are just, and that he ought to acknowledge them as such before all heaven. Had he done this, he might have saved himself and many angels. He had not at that time fully cast off his allegiance to God. Though he had left his position as covering cherub, yet if he had been willing to return to God, acknowledge the Creator's wisdom, and satisfied to fill the place appointed him in God's great plan, he would have been reinstated in his office. The time had come for a final decision. He must fully yield to the divine sovereignty or place himself in open rebellion. He nearly reached the decision to return, but pride forbade him. It was too great a sacrifice for one who had been so highly honored to confess that he had been in error, that his imaginings were false, and to yield to the authority which he had been working to prove unjust. A compassionate Creator, in yearning pity for Lucifer and his followers, was seeking to draw them back from the abyss of ruin into which they were about to plunge. But his mercy was misinterpreted. Lucifer pointed to the long-suffering of God as an evidence of his own superiority, an indication that the King of the universe would yet accede to his terms. If the angels would stand firmly with him, he declared, they could yet gain all that they desired. He persistently defended his own course and fully committed himself to the great controversy against his Maker. Thus it was that Lucifer, the light-bearer, the sharer of God's glory, the attendant of his throne, by transgression became Satan, the adversary of God and holy beings, and the destroyer of those whom heaven had committed to his guidance and guardianship. Rejecting with disdain the arguments and entreaties of the loyal angels, he denounced them as deluded slaves. The preference shown to Christ he declared an act of injustice both to himself and to all the heavenly host, and announced that he would no longer submit to this invasion of his rights and theirs. He would never again acknowledge the supremacy of Christ. He had determined to claim the honor which should have been given him and take command of all who had become his followers. And he promised those who would enter his ranks a new and better government. under which all would enjoy freedom. Great numbers of the angels signified their purpose to accept him as their leader. Flattered by the favor with which his advances were received, he hoped to win all the angels to his side, to become equal with God himself, and to be obeyed by the entire host of heaven. Still, the loyal angels urged him and his sympathizers to submit to God, and they set before them the inevitable result should they refuse. He who had created them could overthrow their power and signally punish their rebellious daring. No angel could successfully oppose the law of God, which was as sacred as himself. They warned all to close their ears against Lucifer's deceptive reasoning, and urged him and his followers to seek the presence of God without delay and confess the error of questioning his wisdom and authority. Many were disposed to heed this counsel, to repent of their disaffection and seek to be again received into favor with the Father and his Son. But Lucifer had another deception ready. The mighty revolter now declared that the angels who had united with him had gone too far to return, that he was acquainted with the divine law and knew that God would not forgive. He declared that all who should submit to the authority of heaven would be stripped of their honor, degraded from their position. For himself, he was determined never again to acknowledge the authority of Christ. The only course remaining for him and his followers, he said, was to assert their liberty and gain by force the rights which had not been willingly accorded them. So far as Satan himself was concerned, it was true that he had now gone too far to return, but not so with those who had been blinded by his deceptions. To them the counsel and entreaties of the loyal angels opened a door of hope, and had they heeded the warning, they might have broken away from the snare of Satan. But pride, love for their leader, and the desire for unrestricted freedom were permitted to bear sway, and the pleadings of divine love and mercy were finally rejected. God permitted Satan to carry forward his work until the spirit of disaffection ripened into active revolt. It was necessary for his plans to be fully developed, that their true nature and tendency might be seen by all. Lucifer, as the anointed cherub, had been highly exalted. He was greatly loved by the heavenly beings, and his influence over them was strong. God's government included not only the inhabitants of heaven, but of all the worlds that he had created. And Lucifer had concluded that if he could carry the angels of heaven with him in rebellion, he could carry also all the worlds. He had artfully presented his side of the question, employing sophistry and fraud to secure his objects. His power to deceive was very great. By disguising himself in a cloak of falsehood, he had gained an advantage. All his acts were so clothed with mystery that it was difficult to disclose to the angels the true nature of his work. Until fully developed, it could not be made to appear the evil thing it was. His disaffection would not be seen to be rebellion. Even the loyal angels could not fully discern his character or see to what his work was leading. Lucifer had at first so conducted his temptations that he himself stood uncommitted. The angels, whom he could not bring fully to his side, he accused of indifference to the interests of heavenly beings. The very work which he himself was doing he charged upon the loyal angels. It was his policy to perplex with subtle arguments concerning the purposes of God. Everything that was simple he shrouded in mystery, and by artful perversion cast doubt upon the plainest statements of Jehovah. And his high position, so closely connected with the divine government, gave greater force to his representations. God could employ only such means as were consistent with truth and righteousness. Satan could use what God could not, flattery and deceit. He had sought to falsify the Word of God and had misrepresented his plan of government, claiming that God was not just in imposing laws upon the angel, that in requiring submission and obedience from his creatures he was seeking merely the exaltation of himself. It was therefore necessary to demonstrate before the inhabitants of heaven and of all the worlds that God's government is just, his law perfect. Satan had made it appear that he himself was seeking to promote the good of the universe. The true character of the usurper and his real object must be understood by all. He must have time to manifest himself by his wicked works. The discord which his own course had caused in heaven, Satan charged upon the government of God. All evil he declared to be the result of the divine administration. He claimed that it was his own object to improve upon the statutes of Jehovah. Therefore God permitted him to demonstrate the nature of his claims, to show the working out of his proposed changes in the divine law. His own work must condemn him. Satan had claimed from the first that he was not in rebellion. The whole universe must see the deceiver unmasked. Even when he was cast out of heaven, infinite wisdom did not destroy Satan. Since only the service of love can be acceptable to God, the allegiance of his creatures must rest upon a conviction of his justice and benevolence. The inhabitants of heaven and of the worlds, being unprepared to comprehend the nature or consequences of sin, could not then have seen the justice of God in the destruction of Satan. Had he been immediately blotted out of existence, some would have served God from fear rather than from love. The influence of the deceiver would not have been fully destroyed, nor would the spirit of rebellion have been utterly eradicated. For the good of the entire universe, through ceaseless ages, he must more fully develop his principles, that his charges against the divine government might be seen in their true light by all created beings, and that the justice and mercy of God and the immutability of his law might be forever placed beyond all question. Satan's rebellion was to be a testimony to the universe through all coming ages, a perpetual testimony to the nature of sin and its terrible results. The working out of Satan's rule, its effect upon both men and angels, would show what must be the fruit of setting aside the divine authority. It would testify that with the existence of God's government is bound up the well-being of all the creatures he has made. Thus the history of this terrible experiment of rebellion was to be a perpetual safeguard to all holy beings, to prevent them from being deceived as to the nature of transgression, to save them from committing sin and suffering its penalty. He that ruleth in the heavens is the one who sees the end from the beginning, the one before whom the mysteries of the past and the future are alike outspread, and who beyond the woe and darkness and ruin that sin has wrought, beholds the accomplishment of his own purposes of love and blessing. Though clouds and darkness are round about him, righteousness and judgment are the foundation of his throne. And this the inhabitants of the universe, both loyal and disloyal, will one day understand. His work is perfect for all. Chapter 2, the Creation. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was. He commanded, and it stood fast. He laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be removed forever. As the earth came forth from the hand of its Maker, it was exceedingly beautiful. Its surface was diversified with mountains, hills, and plains, interspersed with noble rivers and lovely lakes. But the hills and mountains were not abrupt and rugged, abounding in terrific steeps and frightful chasms as they now do. The sharp, ragged edges of earth's rocky framework were buried beneath a fruitful soil, which everywhere produced a luxuriant growth of verdure. There were no loathsome swamps nor barren deserts. Graceful shrubs and delicate flowers greeted the eye at every turn. The heights were crowned with trees more majestic than any that now exist. The air, untainted by foul miasm, was clear and healthful. The entire landscape outvied in beauty the decorated grounds of the proudest palace. The angelic host viewed the scene with delight and rejoiced at the wonderful works of God. After the earth with its teeming animal and vegetable life had been called into existence, man, the crowning work of the Creator and the one for whom the beautiful earth had been fitted up, was brought upon the stage of action. To him was given dominion over all that his eye could behold, For God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over all the earth. So God created man in his own image, male and female created he them. Here is clearly set forth the origin of the human race, and the divine record is so plainly stated that there is no occasion for erroneous conclusions. God created man in his own image. Here is no mystery. There is no ground for the supposition that man is evolved by slow degrees of development from the lower forms of animal or vegetable life. Such teaching lowers the great work of the Creator to the level of man's narrow earthly conceptions. Men are so intent upon excluding God from the sovereignty of the universe that they degrade man and defraud him of the dignity of his origin. He who set the starry worlds on high and tinted with delicate skill the flowers of the field, who filled the earth and the heavens with the wonders of his power, when he came to crown his glorious work, to place one in the midst to stand as ruler of the fair earth, did not fail to create a being worthy of the hand that gave him life. The genealogy of our race, as given by inspiration, traces back its origin not to a line of developing germs, mollusks, and quadrupeds, but to the great Creator. Though formed from the dust, Adam was the Son of God. He was placed as God's representative over the lower orders of being. They cannot understand or acknowledge the sovereignty of God, yet they were made capable of loving and serving man. The psalmist says, Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and whatsoever passes through the paths of the seas. Man was to bear God's image, both in outward resemblance and in character. Christ alone is the express image of the Father, but man was formed in the likeness of God. His nature was in harmony with the will of God. His mind was capable of comprehending divine things. His affections were pure. His appetites and passions were under the control of reason. He was holy and happy in bearing the image of God and in perfect obedience to His will. As man came forth from the hand of his Creator, he was of lofty stature and perfect symmetry. His countenance bore the ruddy tint of health and glowed with the light of life and joy. Adam's height was much greater than that of men who now inhabit the earth. Eve was somewhat less in stature, yet her form was noble and full of beauty. The sinless pair wore no artificial garments. They were clothed with a covering of light and glory, such as the angels wear. So long as they lived in obedience to God, this robe of light continued to enshroud them. After the creation of Adam, every living creature was brought before him to receive its name. He saw that to each had been given a companion, but among them there was not found an helpmeet for him. Among all the creatures that God had made on the earth, there was not one equal to man. And God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make an helpmeet for him. Man was not made to dwell in solitude. He was to be a social being. Without companionship, the beautiful scenes and delightful employments of Eden would have failed to yield perfect happiness. Even communion with angels could not have satisfied his desire for sympathy and companionship. There was none of the same nature to love and to be loved. God Himself gave Adam a companion. He provided an helpmeet for him, a helper corresponding to him, one who was fitted to be his companion and who could be one with him in love and sympathy. Eve was created from a rib taken from the side of Adam, signifying that she was not to control him as the head, nor to be trampled under his feet as an inferior, but to stand by his side as an equal, to be loved and protected by him. A part of man, bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, she was his second self, showing the close union and the affectionate attachment that should exist in this relation. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one. God celebrated the first marriage. Thus the institution has for its originator the Creator of the universe. Marriage is honorable. It is one of the first gifts of God to man, and is one of the two institutions that after the fall Adam brought with him beyond the gates of paradise. When the divine principles are recognized and obeyed in this relation, marriage is a blessing. It guards the purity and happiness of the race. It provides for man's social needs. It elevates the physical and intellectual and the moral nature. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there He put the man whom He had formed. Everything that God had made was the perfection of beauty, and nothing seemed wanting that could contribute to the happiness of the holy pair. Yet the Creator gave them still another token of His love by preparing a garden especially for their home. In this garden were trees of every variety, and many of them laden with fragrant and delicious fruit. There were lovely vines growing upright, yet presenting a most graceful appearance, with their branches drooping under their load of tempting fruit of the richest and most varied hues. It was the work of Adam and Eve to train the branches of the vine to form bowers, thus making for themselves a dwelling from living trees covered with foliage and fruit. There were fragrant flowers of every hue in rich profusion. In the midst of the garden stood the tree of life, surpassing in glory all other trees. Its fruit appeared like apples of gold and silver, and had the power to perpetuate life. The creation was now complete. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all of the host of them. And God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. Eden bloomed on earth. Adam and Eve had free access to the tree of life. No taint of sin or shadow of death marred the fair creation. The morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The great Jehovah had laid the foundations of the earth. He had dressed the whole earth in a garb of beauty, and had filled it with things useful to man. He had created all the wonders of the land and of the sea. In 6 days the great work of creation had been accomplished, and God rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. God looked with satisfaction upon the work of His hands. All was perfect, worthy of its divine author, and He rested not as one weary, but as well pleased with the fruits of His wisdom and goodness and the manifestation of His glory. After resting upon the seventh day, God sanctified it, or set it apart, as a day of rest for man. Following the example of the Creator, man was to rest upon this sacred day, that as he should look upon the heavens and earth, he might reflect upon God's great work of creation, and that as he should behold the evidences of God's wisdom and goodness, his heart might be filled with love and reverence for His Maker. In Eden, God set up the memorial of His work of creation in placing His blessing upon the seventh day. The Sabbath was committed to Adam, the father and representative of. Chapter 3, the Temptation and Fall. No longer free to stir up rebellion in heaven, Satan's enmity against God found a new field in plotting the ruin of the human race. In the happiness and peace of the holy pair in Eden, he beheld a vision of the bliss that to him was forever lost. Moved by envy, he determined to incite them to disobedience and bring upon them the guilt and penalty of sin. He would change their love to distrust and their songs of praise to reproaches against their Maker. Thus he would not only plunge these innocent beings into the same misery which he himself was enduring, but would cast dishonor upon God and cause grief in heaven. Our first parents were not left without a warning of the danger that threatened them. Heavenly messengers opened to them the history of Satan's fall and his plots for their destruction, unfolding more fully the nature of the divine government which the Prince of Evil was trying to overthrow. It was by disobedience to the just commands of God that Satan and his host had fallen. How important, then, that Adam and Eve should honor that law by which alone it was possible for order and equity to be maintained. The law of God is as sacred as Himself. It is a revelation of His will, a transcript of His character, the expression of divine love and wisdom. The harmony of creation depends upon the perfect conformity of all beings, of everything, animate and inanimate, to the law of the Creator. God has ordained laws for the government not only of living beings, but of all the operations of nature. Everything is under fixed laws which cannot be disregarded. But while everything in nature is governed by natural laws, man alone of all that inhabits the earth is amenable to moral law. To man, the crowning work of creation, God has given power to understand His requirements, to comprehend the justice and beneficence of His law and its sacred claims upon them, and of man unswerving obedience is required. Like the angels, the dwellers in Eden had been placed upon probation. Their happy estate could be retained only on condition of fidelity to the Creator's law. They could obey and live, or disobey and perish. God had made them the recipients of rich blessings, but should they disregard His will, He who spared not the angels that sinned could not spare them. Transgression would forfeit His gifts and bring upon them misery and ruin. The angels warned them to be on their guard against the devices of Satan, for his efforts to ensnare them would be unwearied. While they were obedient to God, the evil one could not harm them, for if need be, every angel in heaven would be sent to their help. If they steadfastly repelled his first insinuations, they would be as secure as the heavenly messengers. But should they once yield to temptation, their nature would become so depraved that in themselves they would have no power and no disposition to resist Satan. The tree of knowledge had been made a test of their obedience and their love to God. The Lord had seen fit to lay upon them but one prohibition as to the use of all that was in the garden. But if they should disregard His will in this particular, they would incur the guilt of transgression. Satan was not to follow them with continual temptations. He could have access to them only at the forbidden tree. Should they attempt to investigate its nature, they would be exposed to his wiles. They were admonished to give careful heed to the warning which God had sent them, and to be content with the instruction which He had seen fit to impart. In order to accomplish his work unperceived, Satan chose to employ as his medium the serpent, a disguise well adapted for his purpose of deception. The serpent was then one of the wisest and most beautiful creatures on the earth. It had wings, and while flying through the air presented an appearance of dazzling brightness, having the color and brilliancy of burnished gold. Resting in the rich-laden branches of the forbidden tree and regaling itself with the delicious fruit, it was an object to arrest the attention and delight the eye of the beholder. Thus in the garden of peace lurked the destroyer, watching for his prey. The angels had cautioned Eve to beware of separating herself from her husband while occupied in their daily labor in the garden. With him she would be in less danger from temptation than if she were alone. But absorbed in her pleasing task, she unconsciously wandered from his side. On perceiving that she was alone, she felt an apprehension of danger, but dismissed her fears, deciding that she had sufficient wisdom and strength to discern evil and to withstand it. Unmindful of the angel's caution, she soon found herself gazing with mingled curiosity and admiration upon the forbidden tree. The fruit was very beautiful, and she questioned with herself why God had withheld it from them. Now was the tempter's opportunity. As if he were able to discern the workings of her mind, he addressed her. "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?" Eve was surprised and startled, as she thus seemed to hear the echo of her thoughts. But the serpent continued in a musical voice with subtle praise of her surpassing loveliness, and his words were not displeasing. Instead of fleeing from the spot, she lingered wonderingly to hear a serpent speak. Had she been addressed by a being like the angels, her fears would have been excited. But she had no thought that the fascinating serpent could become the medium of the fallen foe. To the tempter's ensnaring question, she replied, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." By partaking of this tree, he declared, they would attain to a more exalted sphere of existence and enter a broader field of knowledge. He himself had eaten of the forbidden tree, and as a result had acquired the power of speech. And he insinuated that the Lord jealously desired to withhold it from them, lest they should be exalted to equality with himself. It was because of its wonderful properties, imparting wisdom and power, that he had prohibited them from tasting or even touching it. The tempter intimated that the divine warning was not to be actually fulfilled. It was designed merely to intimidate them. How could it be possible for them to die? Had they not eaten of the tree of life? God had been seeking to prevent them from reaching a nobler development and finding greater happiness. Such has been Satan's work from the days of Adam to the present, and he has pursued it with great success. He tempts men to distrust God and to doubt His wisdom. He is constantly seeking to excite a spirit of irreverent curiosity, a restless, inquisitive desire to penetrate the secrets of divine wisdom and power. In their efforts to search out what God has been pleased to withhold, multitudes overlook the truths which He has revealed and which are essential to salvation. Satan tempts men to disobedience by leading them to believe they are entering a wonderful field of knowledge. But this is all a deception. Elated with their ideas of progression, they are, by trampling upon God's requirements, setting their feet in the path that leads to degradation and death. Satan represented to the holy pair that they would be gainers by breaking the law of God. Do we not today hear similar reasoning? Many talk of the narrowness of those who obey God's commandments, while they themselves claim to have broader ideas and to enjoy greater liberty. What is this but an echo of the voice from Eden? In the day ye eat thereof, transgress the divine requirements, ye shall be as gods. Satan claimed to have received great good by eating of the forbidden fruit, but he did not let it appear that by transgression he had become an outcast from heaven. Though he had found sin to result in infinite loss, he concealed his own misery in order to draw others into the same position. So now the transgressor seeks to disguise his true character. He may claim to be holy, but his exalted profession only makes him the more dangerous as a deceiver. He is on the side of Satan, trampling upon the law of God and leading others to do the same, to their eternal ruin. Eve really believed the words of Satan, but her belief did not save her from the penalty of sin. She disbelieved the words of God, and this is what led to her fall. In the judgment, men will not be condemned because they conscientiously believed a lie, but because they did not believe the truth, because they neglected the opportunity of learning what is truth. Notwithstanding the sophistry of Satan to the contrary, it is always disastrous to disobey God. We must set our hearts to know what is truth. All the lessons which God has caused to be placed on record in His Word are for our warning and instruction. They are given to save us from deception. Their neglect will result in ruin to ourselves. Whatever contradicts God's Word, we may be sure, proceeds from Satan. The serpent plucked the fruit of the forbidden tree and placed it in the hands of the half-reluctant Eve. Then he reminded her of her own words that God had forbidden them to touch it, lest they die. She would receive no more harm from eating the fruit, he declared, than from touching it. Perceiving no evil result from what she had done, Eve grew bolder. When she saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat. It was grateful to the taste, and as she ate, she seemed to feel a vivifying power, and imagined herself entering upon a higher state of existence. Without a fear, she plucked and ate, and now, having herself transgressed, she became the agent of Satan in working the ruin of her husband. In a state of strange, unnatural excitement, with her hands filled with the forbidden fruit, she sought his presence and related all that had occurred. An expression of sadness came over the face of Adam. He appeared astonished and alarmed. To the words of Eve he replied that this must be the foe against whom they had been warned, and by the divine sentence she must die. In answer she urged him to eat, repeating the words of the serpent, that they should not surely die. She reasoned that this must be true, for she felt no evidence of God's displeasure, but on the contrary realized a delicious, exhilarating influence, thrilling every faculty with new life, such she imagined as inspired the heavenly messengers. Adam understood that his companion had transgressed the command of God, disregarded the only prohibition laid upon them as a test of their fidelity and love. There was a terrible struggle in his mind. He mourned that he had permitted Eve to wander from his side. But now the deed was done. He must be separated from her whose society had been his joy. How could he have it thus? Adam had enjoyed the companionship of God and of holy angels. He had looked upon the glory of the Creator. He understood the high destiny open to the human race should they remain faithful to God. Yet all these blessings were lost sight of in the fear of losing that one gift which in his eyes outweighed every other. Love, gratitude, loyalty to the Creator, all were overborne by love to Eve. She was a part of himself, and he could not endure the thought of separation. He did not realize that the same infinite power who had from the dust of the earth created him, a living, beautiful form, and had in love given him a companion, could supply her place. He resolved to share her fate. If she must die, he would die with her. After all, he reasoned, might not the words of the wise serpent be true? Eve was before him as beautiful and apparently as innocent as before this act of disobedience. She expressed greater love for him than before. No sign of death appeared in her, and he decided to brave the consequences. He seized the fruit and quickly ate. After his transgression, Adam at first imagined himself entering upon a higher state of existence. But soon the thought of his sin filled him with terror. The air, which had hitherto been of a mild and uniform temperature, seemed to chill the guilty pair. The love and peace which had been theirs was gone, and in its place they felt a sense of sin, a dread of the future, a nakedness of soul. The robe of light which had enshrouded them now disappeared, and to supply its place they endeavored to fashion for themselves a covering, for they could not, while unclothed, meet the eye of God and holy angels. They now began to see the true character of their sin. Adam reproached his companion for her folly in leaving his side and permitting herself to be deceived by the serpent. But they both flattered themselves that he who had given them so many evidences of his love would pardon this one transgression, or that they would not be subjected to so dire a punishment as they had feared. Satan exulted in his success. He had tempted the woman to distrust God's love, to doubt His wisdom, and to transgress His law, and through her he had caused the overthrow of Adam. But the great lawgiver was about to make known to Adam and Eve the consequences of their transgression. The divine presence was manifested in the garden. In their innocence and holiness they had joyfully welcomed the approach of their Creator. But now they fled in terror and sought to hide in the deepest recesses of the garden. But the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldst not eat? Adam could neither deny nor excuse his sin, but instead of manifesting penitence, he endeavored to cast the blame upon his wife, and thus upon God himself. The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. And he who from love to Eve had deliberately chosen to forfeit the approval of God, his home in paradise, and the eternal life of joy, could now, after his fall, endeavor to make his companion and even the Creator himself responsible for the transgression. So terrible is the power of sin. When the woman was asked, "What is this that thou hast done?" she answered, "The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat." Why didst thou create the serpent? Why didst thou suffer him to enter Eden? These were the questions implied in her excuse for her sin. Thus, like Adam, she charged God with the responsibility of her fall. The spirit of self-justification originated in the father of lies. It was indulged by our first parents as soon as they yielded to the influence of Satan, and has been exhibited by all the sons and daughters of Adam. Instead of humbly confessing their sins, they try to shield themselves by casting the blame upon others, upon circumstances, or upon God, making even his blessings an occasion of murmuring against him. The Lord then passed sentence upon the serpent. "Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life." Since it had been employed as Satan's medium, the serpent was to share the visitation of divine judgment. From the most beautiful and admired of the creatures of the field, it was to become the most groveling and detested of them all, feared and hated by both man and beast. The words next addressed to the serpent applied directly to Satan himself, pointing forward to his ultimate defeat and destruction. "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Eve was told of the sorrow and pain that must henceforth be her portion, and the Lord said, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." In the creation, God had made her the equal of Adam. Had they remained obedient to God in harmony with his great law of love, they would ever have been in harmony with each other. But sin had brought discord, and now their union could be maintained and harmony preserved only by submission on the part of the one or the other. Eve had been the first in transgression, and she had fallen into temptation by separating from her companion contrary to the divine direction. It was by her solicitation that Adam sinned, and she was now placed in subjection to her husband. Had the principles enjoined in the law of God been cherished by the fallen race, this sentence, though growing out of the results of sin, would have proved a blessing to them. But man's abuse of the supremacy thus given him has too often rendered the lot of woman very bitter and made her life a burden. Eve had been perfectly happy by her husband's side in her Eden home, but like restless modern Eve, she was flattered with the hope of entering a higher sphere than that which God had assigned her. In attempting to rise above her original position, she fell far below it. A similar result will be reached by all who are unwilling to take up cheerfully their life duties in accordance with God's plan. In their efforts to reach positions for which He has not fitted them, many are leaving vacant a place where they might be a blessing. In their desire for a higher sphere, many have sacrificed true womanly dignity and nobility of character, and have left undone the very work that heaven appointed them. To Adam the Lord declared, "Because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return." It was not the will of God that the sinless pair should know aught of evil. He had freely given them the good, and had withheld the evil. But contrary to His command, they had eaten of the forbidden tree, and now they would continue to eat of it. They would have the knowledge of evil all the days of their life. From that time the race would be afflicted by Satan's temptations. Instead of the happy labor heretofore appointed them, anxiety and toil were to be their lot. They would be subject to disappointment, grief, and pain, and finally to death. Under the curse of sin, all nature was to witness to man of the character and results of rebellion against God. When God made man, He made him ruler over the earth and all living creatures. So long as Adam remained loyal to heaven, all nature was in subjection to him. But when he rebelled against the divine law, the inferior creatures were in rebellion against his rule. Thus the Lord in His great mercy would show men the sacredness of His law and lead them by their own experience to see the danger of setting it aside even in the slightest degree. And the life of toil and care which was henceforth to be man's lot was appointed in love. It was a discipline rendered needful by his sin to place a check upon the indulgence of appetite and passion to develop habits of self-control. It was a part of God's great plan for man's recovery from the ruin and degradation of sin. The warning given to our first parents, "In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die," did not imply that they were to die on the very day when they partook of the forbidden fruit. But on that day the irrevocable sentence would be pronounced. Immortality was promised on condition of obedience. By transgression they would forfeit eternal life. That very day they would be doomed to death. In order to possess an endless existence, man must continue to partake of the tree of life. Deprived of this, his vitality would gradually diminish until life should become extinct. It was Satan's plan that Adam and Eve should, by disobedience, incur God's displeasure. And then, if they failed to obtain forgiveness, he hoped that they would eat of the tree of life and thus perpetuate an existence of sin and misery. But after man's fall, holy angels were immediately commissioned to guard the tree of life. Around these angels flashed beams of light having the appearance of a glittering sword. None of the family of Adam were permitted to pass that barrier to partake of the life-giving fruit. Hence there is not an immortal sinner. The tide of woe that flowed from the transgression of our first parents is regarded by many as too awful a consequence for so small a sin, and they impeach the wisdom and justice of God in His dealings with man. But if they would look more deeply into this question, they might discern their error. God created man after His own likeness, free from sin. The earth was to be peopled with beings only a little lower than the angels. But their obedience must be tested, for God would not permit the world to be filled with those who would disregard His law. Yet in His great mercy He appointed Adam no severe test, and the very lightness of the prohibition made the sin exceedingly great. If Adam could not bear the smallest of tests, he could not have endured a greater trial had he been entrusted with higher responsibilities. Had some great test been appointed Adam, then those whose hearts inclined to evil would have excused themselves by saying, "This is a trivial matter, and God is not so particular about little things," and there would be continual transgression in things looked upon as small and which pass unrebuked among men. But the Lord has made it evident that sin in any degree is offensive to Him. To Eve it seemed a small thing to disobey God by tasting the fruit of the forbidden tree, and to tempt her husband also to transgress. But their sin opened the floodgates of woe upon the world. Who can know in the moment of temptation the terrible consequences that will result from one wrong step? Many who teach that the law of God is not binding upon man urge that it is impossible for man to obey its precepts. But if this were true, why did Adam suffer the penalty of transgression? The sin of our first parents brought guilt and sorrow upon the world, and had it not been for the goodness and mercy of God, would have plunged the race into hopeless despair. Let none deceive themselves. The wages of sin is death. The law of God can no more be transgressed with impunity now than when the sentence was pronounced upon the father of mankind. After their sin, Adam and Eve were no longer to dwell in Eden. They earnestly entreated that they might remain in the home of their innocence and joy. They confessed that they had forfeited all right to that happy abode, but pledged themselves for the future to yield strict obedience to God. But they were told that their nature had become depraved by sin. They had lessened their strength to resist evil, and had opened the way for Satan to gain more ready access to them. In their innocence they had yielded to temptation, and now in a state of conscious guilt they would have less power to maintain their integrity. In humility and unutterable sadness they bade farewell to their beautiful home and went forth to dwell upon the earth where rested the curse of sin. The atmosphere, once so mild and uniform in temperature, was now subject to marked changes, and the Lord mercifully provided them with a garment of skins as a protection from the extremes of heat and cold. As they witnessed in drooping flower and falling leaf the first signs of decay, Adam and his companion mourned more deeply than men now mourn over their dead. The death of the frail, delicate flowers was indeed a cause of sorrow, but when the goodly trees cast off their leaves, the scene brought vividly to mind the stern fact that death is the portion of every living thing. The Garden of Eden remained upon the earth long after man had become an outcast from its pleasant paths. The fallen race were long permitted to gaze upon the home of innocence, their entrance barred only by the watching angels. At the cherubim-guarded gate of paradise the divine glory was revealed. Hither came Adam and his sons to worship God. Here they renewed their vows of obedience to that law, the transgression of which had banished them from Eden. When the tide of iniquity overspread the world and the wickedness of men determined their destruction by a flood of waters, the hand that had planted Eden withdrew it from the earth. But in the final restitution, when there shall be a new heaven and a new earth, it is to be restored, more gloriously adorned than at the beginning. Then they that have kept God's commandments shall breathe in immortal vigor beneath the tree of life, and through unending ages the inhabitants of sinless worlds shall behold in that garden of delight a sample of the perfect work of God's creation, untouched by the curse of sin, a